Hey guys, this is going to be my my video for the installation of the SLT Trigger Kit, or it could also be a homebrew trigger kit, one that you put together from parts that are similar to that found in this kit. I got this the SLT Trigger Kit on eBay for 15 bucks. Came with an exploded view of the trigger assembly, 2-page instructions, and then in the baggie here, get it without. There's the spring, the actual trigger spring that will replace the lawyer spring that's in the trigger currently. A tiny Allen screw, a tiny set screw that goes in the new trigger. A piece of emery cloth, fine emery cloth for polishing the sear, and a couple of nylon washers to keep the trigger centered properly. The tools that you'll need, it's just simple stuff. Got a number 2 Phillips. This is a drift punch that I made a long time ago for disassembling Glocks, but it's just a Craftsman number 1 Phillips that had a stripped out head, and I ground it down on a bench grinder to make a drift punch for working on guns. And then a small flathead screwdriver. Something smaller than you would find on a typical combo screwdriver like this. Some grease. This is something that I have left over from working on doing the tune kits on the spring rifles. And some blue Loctite. I also have some rubbing alcohol. This is 91%, but 73 or whatever the other one is will probably work fine. And the reason for that is just I already destocked the rifle, and then I realized I should be doing a video of this. But these 2 screws here, you'll notice the threads are oily. There's oil that's leaking from other parts of the gun onto the threads of these screws, which keeps them from accepting the thread lock properly. And in the long run, what that means is these slowly loosen up, and then your zero wanders. I think people are blaming their scopes, you know, the cheap 4X scope that comes with the rifle, or the cheap rings that come with the rifle, and it may not be to blame. And then the rear screw, you can see it's holding Loctite okay. That's the one that came from behind the trigger assembly. So the first step I didn't show, but it's pretty easy. You just take out the, get back over here. There's 2 screws that go here diagonally into the stock on each side, and I kind of like this part about the design, but there's 3 stock screws. They're all the same length, pitch, head type. That was nice and considerate of them to do that instead of mixing up all different kinds of screws. Zoom back a little bit here. So just show you real quick how that came apart. So you got one there on the other side, and one back here. And there's a nice hole in the back of the trigger housing, or in the back of the trigger guard here, that gives you access to that. When you're picking a number 2 Phillips, if you have just a regular Phillips, not like a stepped shaft one like this, that'll be a little bit easier for access. This one worked fine. This is just a cheap Stanley 6-in-1 from Home Depot. So the first step is to remove those 3 screws. You take the stock off and put that aside. And then I notice, I cut that a little closer again. And then I notice here in this area, all the oil that's in this area that has leaked into those screws, and there may have been more oil and grease from inside here also. So the first thing I'm going to do is get my rubbing alcohol and a rag and clean that up, because it doesn't really need to be on the outside of this. The only reason that would be useful would be if you're, you know, if it's a damp climate and you're trying to use it as a rust protectant. Okay, the next step is, let's see, here's the trigger assembly that we're going to be working on here. And let's see, I'm going to move this over this way a little bit so weight is better on the table. There's an E-clip. I'm gonna just, this disconnects here. It's just a plastic connecting rod. There's an E-clip here and here on the trigger group, and the next step is to remove that. So I'm going to do that live on video here. You're going to get to see me fire it across the room. Oh no, it's sorry, it's this one. There's one on either side. I don't think it matters which one you pop out. I'm going to do this side though. Let's see, get a better camera view for you. Okay, got a better view for you here. So let me zoom in again a little more. So this is the E-clip I'm going to pop out. Hopefully I won't fire that across the room. I'm going to try and hold it captive with this finger here as I do it. Let's see if I can turn this around and get you a good view. Very easy to lose these things, guys, so take it easy. Oh, that was pretty painless. So there it is. Got the E-clip off. Zoomed in too close, doesn't want to focus. There we go. So put that somewhere where I won't lose it. And the next step is for us to push this pin out. Call that the trigger pin in the instructions. So here you can get like your drift punch, or maybe even a, you know, push in a little bit on this to release the spring tension on that, and then that'll pop out easily enough. And then we have that out. It's the pin with the E-clip in the other side. So you can see the E-clips hold it captive on both sides. You can pop it out either side that's got a little oil on it. And at that point, the trigger should just come out. Just seeing how this works, because I think I'm going to do the optional step of polishing the sear surface, and I don't know if you can see here, but this is kind of a rough surface. It's one of the acting surfaces for the trigger, so I think I may polish that too. So I'll put the pin aside, the E-clip aside. Okay, the next step is, and then the last step I didn't have the safety swung out of the way, so this is a little easier if you swing that back. The secondary sear is here, that kind of swings out to let the trigger come out easier. Next step is to, you can do it. Focus, you junker. There we go. Looking at the trigger here. And it's got the first stage adjusting screw there. We're going to take that out and replace it with this tiny Allen head set screw. And that, in addition to looking cleaner, since it goes inside, it also has a wider range of adjustment, because you're not limited by the head of the screw. Since there is no head, you can screw it in as far as you want or as far as you need to. So this is where the small flathead screwdriver comes in. Yeah, I can see Crosman put some Loctite in there. Good job. Put that aside. Get our little Allen wrench. Stick that in there. And I think I see some Loctite on this as well. So let's start that in. Make sure not to cross thread it. I don't really mind a long first stage trigger pull as long as it's not hard. So I'm just gonna, I don't know, I'll put it so the head's just coming out like that. Okay. So now we've got the new first stage adjusting screw in the trigger here. You can see it should be sticking out to start with. It should be sticking out about an equal amount above and below the trigger. So that's done. The next step is to take out the wire spring. So here, looking in the bottom of the trigger housing, we can see this, which is the secondary sear. So we kind of swing that up, and there coiled up is the wire spring. So we'll just pop that out. You can use your small flathead screwdriver. And pop that out. And that guy there is what gives the NP2s such a hard trigger pull from the factory. Put that aside. Yeah, that is a really squeezing about as hard as I can to get it to compress. That is a really stiff spring. Here's our replacement spring. They give us a warning in the it's wrapped up in foil here. They give us a warning in the instructions. Be careful, don't compress that too much. This kit, by the way, I think I mentioned it was 15 bucks from eBay. But here you have original spring. Oh yeah. Just off the cuff, that feels like it's about half as stiff. Allegedly, it'll adjust it to be about a 2-pound trigger pull. So next step is to put that onto between the primary and secondary sears. So this is the secondary sear, and this is, if you look at the exploded view that came with the kit, that'll be plain to see. This one that folds out the bottom is the secondary sear. And this one here is the primary sear. And it has a little post on it. Post is not the right word, but something to retain the spring. So I'll let that spring out. Come on, you little bugger. And then I'll put the new spring in there. This is hard to do because I gotta try not to obscure the camera. I gotta keep that from falling down until I get the spring placed. And this secondary sear, by the way, it goes back and forth on the pin that it rides on. And in order to get it back together, it has to be more or less in the center. So put on our spring. This will be easier with the needle nose pliers. But they didn't mention needing it in the instructions, so I'm going to try and do it without. Yeah, there we go. And then there's this little notch here. A little square post is what engages the spring on this side. There we go. So now I'm going to try and keep that from swinging around too much. And before I reassemble it, I'll get it centered like that. I think even if you don't do anything else, that's gonna that's going to make the trigger pull loads better. Hi guys, this is the trigger. I wanted to talk a little bit about polishing the internals to help the trigger pull. But this surface right here on the, let me show you the trigger for orientation. This surface right here, this trigger is cast metal, by the way. Feels like it's pretty heavy, so it's not aluminum, maybe zinc or steel or something. But this surface in here is a little rough. If you have a way to polish that, I think that'll do more good than what they say, what they recommend, which is to polish the sear, the secondary sear here. This is what rides inside the trigger here. And feeling that, it's actually pretty smooth. I don't think I'm going to get a heck of a lot of improvement from smoothing that. And the more I think about it, it might be better not to smooth it, because that sliding in and out of the trigger is what is going to polish this. So if you had like, I don't know what kind of tool you would have to be able to polish the inside of that, but that's kind of rough, and I can see I've only got a couple hundred shots on the gun right now. But I already can see it starting to be polished there. So that's why the trigger pull on these gets better with use, because it's polishing kind of the rough casting surface here on the inside of the trigger. I should say that's part of it. So I don't think I'm going to bother polishing the secondary surface of the sear. I think I'm just going to let it polish itself over time, and maybe you know, work it without it being cocked, to have it polish itself. So but if I wanted to do that, you know, to really do it up right, zoom back out. Doing this on a really tiny little table, so I got to keep moving things around. I would pop out one of these E-clips. I would pop out an E-clip on one side of this pin, which is what holds the secondary sear in. Drift that out, take out the sear, and then I would put the piece of emery paper that came with it on a hard flat surface, like the corner of a hardwood table or a block of metal or something, and just polish that. You don't want to try and do it like this while it's in there, because you don't really want to round off the edges of that. I guess it wouldn't kill it though. Okay, and the next step is to put some grease on the secondary sear where it mates with the trigger. So the trigger is going to go like this. Once we get that centered up, that'll slide back and forth in there a little bit. So we're going to put a little bit of grease in the pinhole and a little bit of grease on the secondary sear where it slides inside the trigger. This is a little slower than I normally would be. And I'm just going to put it in the trigger. Ideally you would use moly grease for this, but I think this will be a lot better than nothing, and this is what I've got on hand. My drift punch again. Okay, got that. Now I'll put some in the pinhole here. And a bit in the other side. Might be a little too much, but I have a feeling some of it's going to slop out when I push that pin in, so I want to make sure I have plenty there, and I'll just wipe off the excess. I'm going to get this off of my drift punch now. Now the next step, we're starting to reassemble already. Close up my grease. Next step is we want to get the sear centered in the housing there so it'll line up with the trigger. There we go. Get the trigger back in. And then we making sure that the, oh, I just lost it again. This is a little easier to do when you're not trying to make sure you're not obstructing the camera view, so don't be intimidated by the fact that I'm fiddling around here. There we go, get that lined up. Get the hole lined up. And it's going to be time to put back the okay, what we're going to do now, and this is a bit of a balancing act, but we've got our plastic washers now. And we're going to put one on each side of the trigger. So this is kind of tricky because it has to be centered so that you can so that we can push the pin back through. We could start getting the parts ready here. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to put just a little bit of grease on each side of the trigger to kind of have a little bit of surface tension to hold the washers. Just right here. Go. Alright guys, got that spring figured out. It goes on the inside of this bar, this plastic connecting bar. And the purpose of that bar seems to be when you cock it, when you break the barrel to cock it, the cocking lever, the cocking shoe is right inside here. The cocking lever goes back on that, which lets the spring pull this back, which blocks the trigger. So this is a cocking safety so that you can't fire it while you're cocking. So if you lose that and you lose this, take this assembly off, then that's what you lose. So probably a good idea to replace that. So the spring goes underneath there and it hooks in this hole, and then it hooks in the hole in the trigger housing. And when you put that back, if you do knock it out, when you put that back, make sure you have the end that's elevated hook on here, and the end that's more recessed hook on there, because it has to account for the offset in this bar compared to the trigger housing. So now it's all back together mechanically. Now we just need to reassemble it into the stock, and I have these nice souvenirs here, the lawyer spring and the short screw so that you can't adjust out too much of the first stage. And looking forward to a good shooting experience. So the last thing is I'm going to douse an area of my rag in isopropyl alcohol, wipe off as much of that oil as I can, as much of the old Loctite as I can, maybe brush some of that out, and then reassemble, re-zero, and see how she goes. Jeez, got a bunch of oil and Loctite in there too. Get rid of that. Let's as much as possible. Look how light they made that stock. I don't know if you can see in there, but it's got like skeletonized bosses. They could have made that all solid and added a little bit of weight, which would have helped with damp the recoil a little bit. But they were thinking mostly about saving plastic, I think, and advertising it as a lightweight hunting gun. Okay. So before I restock this, you know, in case it's have it outside when it's humid or something, I don't want to have any rust issues between the stock and the action. So I just got some 3-in-1 oil. Find a little area of the rag that's not covered in alcohol. Those two will tend to counteract each other, right? Just wipe it on just a little bit here. This is not stainless steel, so it's just has a real kind of a shallow bluing, just enough to be functional. I might regret this later. It might attract dirt or something, but just want a real light coat of oil on the compression tube here where it's... Uh-oh. Damn it, I just popped that spring out again. Okay, well, I got my oil on now. You get to see me fiddle around with this, reconnecting that spring. Okay, now finally to restock it. It's starting to look like a gun again. Get my Loctite ready. This stuff you always spill a little bit, but I try to make the best use of it that I can. The stuff that's on the nozzle here, I just wipe that off on the threads. Ooh, a little too much. I always get a little too much too, you know. Do this back one first, because this is a little trickier. I like to turn it backwards a little bit first. Make sure you hear it, you feel it click when it engages the threads, so you don't have to wonder if you're cross-threading it or anything. Right as that starts to get snug, I'll loosen up a little bit because I want to have all of these replaced before I snug anything up. Tiny drop here. And then the hard part is going to be, I got to put this away and wait for that to set up properly rather than just go off and shoot it like I want to do. That one snugs up a little quicker. Tube of this stuff lasts me forever. This is at least 5 years old, this little tube, and it's pretty reasonably priced at the auto parts store. Okay, so that's the last one, so kind of snug that little by little, alternating sides so that everything is centered up. Not too tight, because I don't remember looking when I had it apart, but sometimes this threads into aluminum. And it does have a lot of threads that engage, but you don't want to strip it either. Okay, So, there we have it. Tuned trigger. Oh yeah, I can already feel how much lighter that is. You could make it even lighter, but they say that if you do, then you won't be able to cock it. It won't be enough to push the secondary sear down to engage it. So the first stage at least is very smooth. Can't wait to shoot it tomorrow. All right, thanks for watching, guys. Next step, I think, is to replace the pivot washers, the plastic pivot washers in here with brass. Make this thing into a champion shooter.